Now we have here, first of all, in chapter 1, it may sound rather facetious to you, the wife who refused to obey her husband. Well, I guess that's not new today, but it was new back in that day when a wife refused to obey her husband. Verse 1, Esther, first chapter. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This is Ahasuerus, who reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. Now, this word Ahasuerus actually is not a name. It's a title. This is the title that this king had. Now, there's been some question as who the king was. Who do we have reference to here? What king is it? Well, I'll take the position that it will be Xerxes, and I believe that's who it is, and I think the book and history will confirm that. But it's interesting to note, and I want to give you a little excerpt that comes from the book published by the British Museum in 1907. It says, "The sculptures and inscriptions of Darius the Great on the rock of Behistun in Persia with the Cyrus cylinders," translation, "it is established that Ahasuerus and Esther were the parents of the Cyrus of Isaiah 44:28, 45, and 1, and so on." May I say to you, it's quite interesting that secular history confirms this. But I believe that we're talking now about the great Xerxes, who reigned here over a kingdom, a great empire, from India, we're told, to Ethiopia, all through that great fertile crescent. That was the very heartland of the world. And a great many folk feel that that is the heartland of the world in which we live today. Well, this man reigned over it. He evidently was Xerxes. Now we're told that in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes, his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. Now, we are introduced here to a great pagan banquet in the palace of Xerxes. And they just had a banquet, you remember, over in the same place, only they had to put up tents. It was what we would call a very swanky affair. Cost millions of dollars. Now, we're going to see a banquet that was a banquet to end all banquets. This was a great one. Why did he do it? He's getting ready to make a campaign against Europe, and Greece in particular. He was one of the rulers of the second great world kingdom that Daniel had mentioned, the Medo-Persian Empire. Now he's calling them together, apparently for the purpose of selling them on a program of going against Greece. And apparently it was a program that he needed to sell it, by the way, because I'm not sure they were too enthusiastic about it. We're told, verse 4, that when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. Now, this is quite remarkable. This is a program that lasted actually for 6 months. And that's a long time to have a program going on. It went 180 days. The father of Louis XV of France was talking with the preceptor of the kingdom, and the father made the statement of Louis XV, said, "How in the world could a man have patience enough to put on this kind of a program for 6 months?" And the preceptor, he said, "How in the world would he be able to pay for it?" Well, that is something that apparently costs millions, even in that day. 6 months he brings them together, and he attempts to sell them on this program of going against Greece. I'm sure that he displayed the fact that he was able to pay for the campaign. And it would always be nice when we go into a war if we could just be sold before we go into it, whether we're going to be able to pay for it or not. Well, this king is selling it to his kingdom and is telling these rulers that he's able to pay for it. And he's also displaying the luxury and the opulence and the wealth of his kingdom. And it was a great pagan feast. It was a godless thing. And now we take a look at it, and there are those that try to find spiritual lessons here. Very candidly, I see none whatsoever. God's introducing us here into a pagan heathen court where decisions are made that affect the world, and it looks as if God is left out. But God wants you to know that He's overruling these circumstances, and He's going to accomplish His own purpose. Now we're told in verse 5, when these days were fulfilled, the king made a feast unto all the people who were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Now here is a banquet that's going to last 7 days, where were white, green, and blue hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rings and pillars of marble. The couches were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black marble. Now, here is the description given to us, and there are those that attempt to find spiritual lessons in this description. I candidly do not see that there's any here. All God is telling us is that in this tremendous display, a gaudy display of wealth, the silver, the gold, and all the jewels, and these beautiful hangings. Now, the ruins of those palaces are still over there. And a few years ago, they celebrated the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire. It's this empire we're talking about now. And there was a banquet made, and you remember all of the magazines and the TV news programs, they showed something of the tremendous display of wealth. It cost millions of dollars. And there was a great deal of criticism because in that land of poverty to have this display. Well, here's the first banquet, apparently, that was put on that we have any record of. And this banquet lasts 7 days. And it was in that palace. They didn't have to build tents on the outside. These marble palaces with these gorgeous display of color in the draperies and the awnings and all of that. It must have been a feast for the eye to have seen it. And this king is selling these people on that. One of the automobile dealers here in California was telling me that many years ago, not too many, several years ago, that when the Chevrolet changed their model and they called all the dealers back to Detroit, and they had a week of selling them, and it culminated in a great banquet to sell this new car. Well, human nature doesn't change. Back here at the very beginning, here in the Medo-Persian Empire, and this was, a great many think, was about 486 B.C., why, he's getting ready to make this campaign. Well, this is a great selling effort on his part. And we read in verse 7, and they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being different one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the bounty of the king. In other words, everything was there in abundance. And this was a great banquet, and the drinking was according to the law. None did compel. And, of course, they weren't as civilized as we are today. Some of these businessmen tell me that it's almost impossible to go to some business meetings today where they have a cocktail party and not participate. One man told me that he had an executive position, and the owner or the president of this tremendous concern called him in. Noticed at one of their social gatherings that he didn't drink. And of all things, I would think today that a president of a corporation would want a sober man. And he rebuked him because he hadn't participated in drinking the cocktails. But you see, we're civilized today, and we force them. Back there, they didn't force them at all. None did compel. For so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the women in the royal house, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Now, Vashti, she made a banquet for the women. You see, the men and the women didn't have a banquet together in that day. That was a breach of social custom to have done that. Again, they are uncivilized, aren't they, not to have it all together and to have a display of sex in some manner or other. But they really didn't. This is serious business. Not selling an automobile, but it's selling a war, a campaign against Greece. And so here Vashti has a meeting of the women's auxiliary. They meet in a separate palace, the palace of Vashti, and she's entertaining the women at this banquet. Now, notice what happens, though. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, and that means he got drunk. This king overstepped himself. You didn't have to drink, but if you wanted to, you could have all you want. And the king apparently was not a teetotaler by any means, and he got drunk. Now he did something that he would never have done had he been sober. He commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zether, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains who served in the presence of Ahasuerus, the king. Now, this was quite an exercise in pronunciation here, but these men were the men who did the bidding of the king. And in his drunken condition, he commands them to go and bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. You see now what he's doing here is a thing that's very ungentlemanly. It was positively crude. He never would have done it had he been sober. And he sends them to bring her. And apparently the reason that he's doing it, he displayed his glory and his riches, and now he wanted them to see the glory of Vashti, his treasure, his jewel, as it were. Well, instead of displaying that, why, we find here that he reveals a family scandal. Notice what happens. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king enraged, and his anger burned in him. I think the king got up when he had sent these chamberlains. He said, now I've got a real surprise for you. I want you to see my queen, and she'll be brought in with the crown royal upon her. And she must have been a beauty. But when the order came over for her to come, she refused. And don't tell me women didn't have rights in that day, because this woman could turn this down. She certainly wasn't forced to come. Now, the king is drunk, and this makes him angry. To begin with, he's embarrassed. Imagine having one of these chamberlains come up and whisper in his ear. And the king says, well, where is the queen? And the chamberlain says, she won't come. She says she's not coming. And now the king's embarrassed. He's got to offer some explanation to the guests that are there, and apparently several thousand at this banquet. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment, and the next unto him was Carshena, Shether, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Messina, Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and who sat at the first in the kingdom. In other words, these men were his cabinet. They were the ones that met with him privately and personally, just like the cabinet meets with the President of the United States. And there are a great many others out in the different departments probably never see the President. Well, these men did. Now he calls a meeting of his cabinet, because this really is very serious. May sound silly to us today. Here's a queen won't come. Why not forget it and go on to something else, have some entertainment at the banquet, which I'm sure he did. But believe me, he calls a meeting of the cabinet, these men for their advice. What are you going to do in an embarrassing moment like this? Well, the question was, verse 15, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti, according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? And apparently, friend, there was no law that they could exercise. We hear today a great deal about the fact that back in those days women were chattels. And it is true that in many cases that was so. But apparently this woman had a great deal of freedom, and there's no law that could force her to come. So they're going to have to come up with a very severe and harsh law. And here it is, and this man Memucan speaks. He's the spokesman here. And let me read verse 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princess, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes, to all the people who are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Now, I want to introduce this little fellow to you. Memucan is a henpecked husband. He's really henpecked. And he's disturbed by this, because if the queen gets by with this little fellow wouldn't want to go home. He's a Mr. Milquetoast, and I don't think he had very much to say in his own home. I think his wife made most of the decisions. I think that's one of the reasons that he speaks out here. There are many men today that where they work, they take orders from others. They never express themselves. And when they're at home, the wife won't let them express themselves. And that's the reason that they speak when they're on a church board. That's the reason you have to listen to some language sometimes that makes no contribution to the welfare or any development of the kingdom of God here on earth, because of the fact that they're just talking and generally make suggestions that are not good to begin with. Well, Memucan is a little henpecked husband, and he's going to speak now because this is his chance. He's one of the princes in the kingdom, and he's this kind of a man. I heard the story about the man. He was also a Mr. Milquetoast, a little henpecked fellow. And he came into his office one day where he worked, and he went around to the different people he worked with. He said, you know, my wife says I'm a model husband. And finally came to a hard-boiled secretary and said to her, you know, my wife says I'm a model husband. And everybody else was commending him, and this hard-boiled secretary, she didn't commend him, says, why don't you look that up in the dictionary, and you won't be so proud of it. He looked it up in the dictionary, and he found out what a model husband was. A model, he found out, is a small imitation of the real thing. And that's what Memucan is. He's a small imitation of the real thing. Now listen to what he says, verse 17. For this deed of the queen shall come to the attention of all women, so that they shall look with contempt upon their husbands when it shall be reported. The king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall all the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes, and he's one of them, you see, who hath heard of the deed of the queen. Thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. He said, I'll have a fight when I go home. In fact, the matter is, I think he'd come to the conclusion that if something wasn't done, he wasn't going home. Now listen to verse 19. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it may not be altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another who is better than she. Well, this is extreme. But notice the reaction of the king and the others. When the king's decree, which he shall make, shall be published throughout all his empire, for it's great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and to small. And the saying pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. For he sent letters into all the king's provinces, into every province according to its writing, and to every people after their language, that every man should bear rule in his own house, and that it should be published according to the language of every people. Now, the decree was this. First of all, the queen is set aside. She's no more to be queen. And the reason given is because she's refused to obey the king. Therefore, a decree has gone out. And that decree is that in the kingdom that a wife is to honor her husband and the man is to rule. And apparently this hadn't been true before in the Medo-Persian Empire, but now it's to be true, and it becomes the law of the Medes and Persians, and it cannot be altered or changed.